So what exactly does it mean when Bible scholars say weak Catholics become Protestant and strong Protestants become Catholic? Years ago, when I was still Protestant evangelical, I was preparing for a debate with a family member, just a friendly debate over dinner. And so I got the best Protestant scholars I could think of. I got their books. First one I read was by the late theologian Norman Geisler. It was co-authored by a guy named Joshua Bedingcourt. I believe he's a Bible scholar. Then the second book I read was by Dr. James White, a great Protestant theologian and apologist. And in the beginning of James White's book, he said the reason he's writing this is because so many evangelical Bible scholars and theologians have become Catholic recently. So I was kind of surprised. I thought it went the other way. All, Catholics became Protestant. So I started doing my research, and one of the first names that came up was Joshua Bedingcourt, the Bible scholar who co-authored that anti-Catholic book with Norman Geisler. And you can read about his story in another convert who was a strong Protestant, Dr. Doug Beaumont, who became Catholic. He has a book called Evangelical Exodus, where he lists dozens of evangelical Bible scholars and the reasons, if you really want to know the reasons why, in their own words, they became Catholic. It's in that book. But there was one that I found, and I found hundreds, but there was one that I found that I could kind of relate to, and his name was Dr. Francis Beckwith. He grew up a Catholic. Then he had an encounter with Jesus. He had like an extra special encounter. He was kind of like just a weak Catholic, had an encounter with Jesus, and became evangelical. Loved the Bible, started studying, became a Bible scholar, became such a great evangelical Bible scholar that he was accepted into a very elite club of Bible scholars called the Evangelical Theological Society. And they thought so highly of Dr. Francis Beckwith, they voted him as president. He was the president of the Evangelical Theological Society. And while he was a president, he became Catholic. And I have a similar story. I'm nowhere near being a Bible scholar, but I grew up Catholic, weak, had a conversion experience with Jesus, an encounter with Jesus. And I started studying the Bible every day. And I had teachers as educated as Dr. Francis. I had one pastor who had a PhD from Liberty University teaching me. I had another pastor with a Master Divinity of one of the top Reformed theological schools. I had pastors like that teaching me, and I learned how to, even though I didn't know how to speak or read Hebrew, I knew how to look it up. I knew how to read the Bible exegetically. I learned about hermeneutics. I learned about reading the Bible in context. And I eventually realized the Catholic faith was true. Now, the biggest hurdle for Protestants is church authority. That's probably the biggest hurdle. You've heard the Bible alone is our authority if you're a Protestant. Some Protestants will look at church tradition and church councils as a guidance, but there's no authority in that to them. The Bible alone is their authority. That is the difference. The Catholic Church for 2,000 years believed we have what Steve Ray calls a three-legged stool: the Bible, apostolic tradition or church tradition, and the magisterium. That's the Pope and his bishops. And they're all equal in authority, and they can never, and they have never, that was the claim I checked out for years before I decided to be Catholic, they've never contradicted each other, which is amazing. And you say, well, the Bible, I believe, could be our authority because God inspired the writers of the Bible, and God is perfect. But I can't trust church leaders, they're imperfect. Well, every Protestant I know loves the state of Israel. They're probably Israel's best friend right now, while the whole world is attacking Israel, and anti-Semitism is on fire throughout the world. And every Protestant will say, yeah, the Jews were God's first chosen people. They were his chosen people. But you see, almost every king of Israel was sinful. They did a lot of bad things, yet God kept Israel as his people, and he guided them. In the same way, everything in the Old Testament foreshadows the New. He took the authority away from the Jews and gave it to the church. And yes, there were imperfect men, but what did he do with these imperfect, sinful men? He was able to inspire them to write an infallible Bible, okay? But how do we know it's an infallible Bible? How do we know? You see, because the Bible, the New Testament we have, took like 40 years to write, and most people couldn't read, and they were illiterate, and they didn't really put it together in a book for years later. And then by the time they did that, it would cost like 3 years' wages because they had to hand write everything on lambskin. So how did the church know what was true? Because Jesus gave us a church. And St. Paul told the Corinthians and he told the Thessalonians to pass on the traditions I have passed on to you. So Jesus gave us a church that gave us the Bible. And we see this in 382 AD at the Council of Rome under the guidance of Pope Damasus, and the church decided on 73 books of the Bible that are still in the Catholic Bible today. And even before that, before they had like a standard canon, in 325 AD, there was a lot of Christians saying Jesus wasn't equal to God. Now, every Protestant evangelical would agree with Catholics that's heresy. Jesus is. But who decided that? It was at the Council of Nicaea. And we still say that Nicene Creed from 325 AD. How did they decide it? By apostolic tradition. They were arguing, and St. Ignatius was the best fighter for apostolic tradition because he grew up in the desert with the desert fathers. St. Anthony and everyone from him on knew the apostles, so it was passed on. And then in 393, at the Council of Hippo, they agreed, yes, these 73 books are canon. At the Council of Carthage, 397 and 419. At the Council of Florence, 1431. And then at the Council of Trent in the 1500s. So it goes to reason, if you don't trust the church who decided which books should be in the Bible, how do you know that they got it right? R.C. Sproul, the late theologian and Protestant, very brilliant guy, he admits this is a problem for Protestantism. He says the only thing we can say as Protestantism is the books are infallible, but the list is fallible because men gave us the list. You know, God didn't say these are the books of the Bible. The church had to decide that. So again, a lot of people realize, wow, the church, God did use imperfect people to make decisions on faith and morals the way the Catholic Church claims. And then we see glaring contradictions in Protestantism. Jesus said, this is my body. Today, modern evangelicals will say, no, he just meant a symbol. And if you look in church history, J.N.D. Kelly, a Protestant historian and scholar, says nowhere in church history in the early church did anyone have this view. Only the heretics had this view. And in fact, Martin Luther didn't have this view. When the view came up, it was 10 years after the Reformation. Oliver Zwingli started saying it was symbolic. And Martin Luther called him a heretic, said this was heresy. And then you can go on dozens of examples how the church changed. Like Lutherans will believe it turns into the body and blood of Christ, but most modern evangelicals will say it's just symbolic. And you see these, and you realize, yes, God did give us a church, just like he protected the Jews, and it was the Jewish people, even though their leaders were sinful. Same thing with the church. And in fact, in the kingdom of Israel, to be a king, you had to prove Davidic lineage, like you came from the line of David. Catholicism, we can prove through apostolic succession that every bishop in the Catholic Church was ordained by a bishop, and eventually we can show you historical, it leads to an apostle. So not only has God protected the doctrinal succession, no doctrines changed, he's protected the apostolic succession. The church he started laid hands, like Paul told Timothy to pick good leaders and lay hands on them. And throughout history, God bless, stay Catholic.